Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Cadman. The date is September 22nd, 2018. This is the Berkeley Friends Meeting Oral History Project. And our speaker today is Joe Magruder. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Joe?
Okay. This is sort of the short version of my life here. And I'm going to start by giving you a couple of themes and then talk about background and then talk about how that background is played out in quite summary form. If things aren't clear, feel free to ask questions. The themes of my life, I would say consistency, which might be read stubbornness or lack of adventure or lack of rebellion, but curiosity, the importance of multiple causation, the importance of being comfortable not knowing things, the importance of contradiction. So those themes will randomly appear in what I'm talking about. So background. And I suppose I should start that with saying that you all know me as Joe. My name is really John Joseph. I'm named for my two grandfathers. John being the grandfather you'd rather not have as a father. But that's the way things are. Like most people in this country, my ancestors came from multiple countries and multiple times. And so when it's convenient, I can point back to my Scotch-Irish ancestors who came in the 1600s, or my English ancestors who came at the same time, or I can point back to my much more responsible Swedish ancestors who came in the late 1800s. So depending on who I want to be, what image I want, it's sort of like us as Quakers. We can point to our Hicksite ancestors, or we can point to the Beanite Quakers and define ourselves those ways. My father was a golf course greenskeeper for most of his working life. He came to California in the 1930s. He was from a family who were poor farmers in kind of central Missouri. He was one of 8 children with a father who was quite abusive by all accounts. During the Second World War, the draft board, who didn't want to have conscientious objectors on their hands, piped him off to an essential industry, and he spent the Second World War working in a dairy south of Los Angeles. My mother was from relatively prosperous farming stock in Minnesota. Although her father actually was a pharmacist, they actually lived in town. She never lived on a farm. Her ancestors were Swedish and English. As I say, the Swedish ancestors came in the 1800s. They came to this country with money. They bought good farmland and were quite prosperous. My mother was a college professor. She taught English. She'd done a master's degree here at Berkeley and then did a PhD at University of Southern California. My grandfather on that side was a pharmacist. My grandmother was not quite a typical housewife. She was very socially active. She was the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in Los Angeles for quite a while. My parents met, it's kind of shameful these days, when my father was her student in a class he took. They claimed they didn't date until after the class was over. My early life, my family life, was one of stability. We lived in a house that my grandparents had bought shortly after they moved to Los Angeles. I think they bought it in 1927. And we were raised in that one house, that one location, one set of schools and everything. Indeed, that's the house where my sister lives now. So we weren't part of the 1950s exodus to the suburbs that a lot of families were. Our family was a fairly frugal family. On the other hand, there were no financial worries, there was no debt. So we generally didn't buy a lot of stuff, but when we wanted to get something, there was never any question about could we afford to do it. It was always possible. The family that encouraged curiosity. I'll describe our dining table was next to a bookcase. Actually, it was a built-in China cabinet that had been converted into a bookcase since the house needed lots of bookcases. The books right by the dining table were atlases, the OED, an encyclopedia, etc. So that whatever question we developed in our dinner table conversation, we had the resources there to find the answer to it. Now today you get on your device and find the answer, but things have changed. The other thing about my family life that has had a long effect was that I had an older sister who had severe cerebral palsy from birth injuries. And she died when I was about 3. That was actually a fairly traumatic. If I point to, was there a time in your life that was traumatic? I'd say, yeah, when I was 3, because several things happened. My older sister died. My grandfather died. We were living in the same home. My father, this was just the end of the Second World War. My father came home from working in the dairy. When he'd been at the dairy, we didn't see a lot of him because he spent nights there a lot. So he came home, and my younger sister was born. So all that trauma happened at the same time. I think I survived it, but especially my older sister, that does come into play later on. So what about religion? And again, we're dealing with background here. When I don't know, I remember it, so it must have been 4 or 5. My family changed churches. We've been Methodists, gone to the First Methodist Church in Los Angeles, and we moved to a congregational church. And the minister of that church was a man named Alan Hunter. He was a well-known pacifist, very active in the Fellowship of Reconciliation, very involved with social action. My mother had come to know him because when she was at Berkeley, she'd gone to St. John's Presbyterian Church, and the minister there was Alan's brother. The congregation was a diverse one, at least racially and ethnically. It was not, I think, economically so diverse. In the kind of high school years, my Sunday school teachers were a couple where she was Ralph Bunch's, I think, niece, some relationship like that. And he was the first African-American principal of a non-minority high school in Los Angeles. And later the first African-American assistant superintendent of the district. Other things about that experience, that church, that experience. This is a church who held property for Japanese families during the Second World War. So, we talk now about people who weren't aware of internship. We were very aware of it. I would identify Alan Hunter as my mentor. Not just pacifism, but a respect for mysticism. Alan was not a mystic, but he had a lot of respect for it. He had close connections with Quakers. Indeed, when I was at Howard, one of the things he did was in Washington, D.C., was to see that I got to the Friends meeting in Washington, as well as to the Church of the Savior. he also taught us to look with, the quote was, "Look with wonder at that which is before you." And he introduced me to the science newsletter as a way of keeping quick track of that part of the world. The Mount Hollywood membership question. I mean, the other thing about we never said a creed. So I've only come to learn the Apostles' Creed, through time with Methodists later on. But the membership question was, do you love Jesus and seek to follow him? And that's a question I can still answer affirmatively. What about school? I mentioned the consistency. I went to one elementary school for 7 years, kindergarten and 6th grade, then 3 years of junior high school and 3 years of high school. No moving between schools. I started 1st grade, I was 5, and at the very young end of the continuum, during the Second World War, the school entering age had been moved up because you could then get women into the workforce if their kids were in school. So I was at the very young end of my grade cohort. This played out in a couple of ways. I didn't learn to read in the 1st grade, and this was very distressing to my mother. She took me for all kinds of psychological tests and all. What's the matter with this kid? And there wasn't anything really the matter. He was bright enough, but he didn't read. Well, there's 2 problems. A, I was young, and B, I was a boy. I did have to go to summer school that year. I learned to read in summer school, which was pretty amazing considering I spent about half the summer school time home with chickenpox. It wasn't until maybe 5 years ago that I read something Malcolm Gladwell had written, where he talked about, I think it was soccer teams, and most soccer players are born in certain months of the year. And the reason for that is the cutoff for when you can become part of a soccer team, when you're, or part of a level of soccer. No, I don't understand the soccer business quite well enough. So it's those kids that are oldest in that cutoff thing who become the best soccer players. And I was at the opposite end of this, so I never got picked for I was always the last one picked for sports teams and all, with good reason. The other place that's played out, though, over the years, that kind of an assumption on my part that other people must understand things better than I do, because after all, lots of my classmates did. And that's still a problem for me, although post Malcolm Gladwell, I have a better understanding of it, when it shouldn't be. I went to college at Whittier College, which is near Los Angeles. I wasn't very adventuresome in going away from home. It never occurred to me to go to, think about going to the Midwest or the East Coast to college. And there were lots of things that were very good about that experience. And just I'll mention 2 quickly, and we're still on background here, don't forget that. One thing is that Whittier, at that point, was really focused on teaching logical, critical thinking and how to organize your thoughts. And we spent a lot of time reading Moby Dick and Hamlet in an effort to how to analyze literature constructively. Now, that's played out very well throughout my life. And the methodology is really quite simple. You take your ideas, you put them down little note cards, and then you sit with a large classification. You draw out, like so, and you sort the note cards out, and to get your thoughts organized, and you also see where the holes are and where you have got to go collect some more information. And indeed, when I was writing this stuff out, that's what I did. I made my stack of 100 or so note cards and sorted them out, found the holes, and then wrote an outline. And that's been terribly useful to me. The other thing that happened was that, we'll drop back to Alan Hunter again. He had a minister who was a friend of his. Indeed, the guy had been a student pastor in our church at some point. And he introduced me to this guy and to the Methodist Church and to the Wesley Fellowship, which was a college-age group for the Methodist Church. I learned quite a bit from the Methodist Church, including how to build houses. But I also met Joanne there. So that was... after Whittier, I went to the University of Southern California for a master's in social work. This was a disappointment to my mother, who really had wanted me to be an academic and not to get this technical degree. Now, I have to say a couple of things about that. Having spent time now at Berkeley and spent a lot of time around academics, I am forever grateful I went and got a technical degree and didn't get an academic degree. The academic game playing, I think, would have been extremely difficult for me. Teaching, not so much, but the intra-faculty stuff. I went to USC because there were only 2 accredited social work programs. Well, UCLA had one, but they were sort of on the rocks with their accreditation. And USC was closer to home than Berkeley was. And again, it didn't occur to me to go out of state. In all of this, there was a couple of kind of transformative experiences. I spent 2 summers with the American Friends Service Committee on work camps. And I can certainly, anytime you want, describe all the problems with work camps, but for me, these were transformative experiences. I learned a lot about what it means to be a farm laborer in California. I had a good introduction to the care of what were then called mentally retarded people in state hospitals, which was quite valuable. Now I'm going to come to a transformative experience, or at least the experience that has affected me quite a bit, that is much a fair later. After I got my MSW, I went to work in a local state hospital in Southern California, and this was pretty much the old-fashioned state hospital. People came to the state hospital, stayed a long time. This was a point where we figured out that we could move chronic patients out of the state hospital because now Social Security disability and what's now called SSI disability was available to pay for their care elsewhere. And so we were quite happily engaged with that because we believed that the what we call institutionalized behavior of the chronic schizophrenic especially was the result of the institution, and that if you don't get people out of these bad places, they would function much better. So we did that. At the same time, or a bit after this, I began my long career on the Friends Committee on Legislation Executive Committee, where we again pushed very hard for new, improved, advanced legislation about the care of the mentally ill. Stuff we know now as the Latimer and Petrus Short Act. Things like Section 5150 that you've heard about. And I was a good ACLU member, and again, we thought this was the way to go. Somewhat later, not too much later, I was working in community mental health with a team of folks going out and evaluating people who seemed to be mentally ill. This was in San Francisco. And we would see these guys, mostly guys, living with their aged mother in a Sunset basement apartment out in the Sunset. And these guys were just like the burned out schizophrenics in the state hospital. Maybe it wasn't the state hospital. Maybe this is what schizophrenia does. And what I mean about this in terms of being a transformative experience is that what I got out of this is the realization that well-intended efforts can often have disastrous unintended consequences. What basically happened with the chronically mentally ill that were state hospital patients is that they became prison inmates, so the portion of the population in prison who was mentally ill, those numbers roughly proportionally reflected the portion of the population that had been in the state hospital. Now, more recently, we pushed low-level offenders out of the prison system, and so now these are the guys that are lying around on the street in Berkeley, the same population. And in a situation where, with intent of improving the quality of people's lives, we have done anything but. So this has made me very cautious in the social action realm. And probably why I'm not looked on as being much of a social action Quaker. You know. I'll say one more thing. Some of you remember Pat Stewart. Pat Stewart was a member of Berkeley Meeting. She was a psychologist at Napa State Hospital. And she came to the FCL early on and said, you know, you guys are on the wrong track here. You don't understand the impact of what you're doing. And she was terribly right about this. And I'm glad I could tell her that later on. Okay, so that's kind of background stuff. How we're doing okay. That's background stuff. So what's happened since then? And I'll talk a little bit about family, a little bit about work, quite a bit about my relationship to Quakerism, because that's what we're about here after all. And then I've got some tag-ins I need to talk about that don't quite fit neatly into that classification. So classification doesn't always work quite perfectly. So what about my family? You know, just kind of quickly. Say Joanne and I married, and after I was in graduate school, her last year of college. We have 3 children. Our oldest is over 50 now. Marie. She lives in Vermont. She's a farmer. She supports, I say she's a farmer, but she supports herself teaching online business administration classes, finance and logistics and stuff like that. She's married. She and Tim have 1 son who's in his last year of college now at Northeastern University in Boston. Their life is good. She's the co-clerk of her Friends Meeting, which is a small rural Friends Meeting in a place called South Starksboro, Vermont. Her middle child is Carl. Carl is a palliative care chaplain. He lives in Eureka. We adopted Carl when he came to live with us when he was a year old. Exactly, well, the day before his birthday, I think. This was an era where transracial adoption was quite accepted. There were lots of Quaker families who, we have a whole cohort of families who were in the same situation. We probably didn't do a very good job teaching Carl about how to be an African American child in this country. We thought by living sort of in downtown Sacramento, not in the suburbs, this would be good. The reality was that the gulf between Carl and most of the other African American kids at Sac High was so great that it was kind of useless. But in spite of that, Carl's done well. Generally, when I'm at Quaker gatherings outside of our immediate world here, people will come to me and say, oh, do you know or are you related to, because they know Carl. What else? Let's see. Carl's got 2 kids. This is part of being in California. Things are kind of different here. I never quite know how to describe this. His he has my 2 grandkids, Imani and Roden, live in the city. They have 2 mommies. Carl's a sperm donor daddy. Carl's got a good relationship with those kids. We have a good relationship with them. You probably know their great uncle, which is David Hartsoe. Our youngest child is Anne. Anne is a Norwegian, lives in Oslo. She has 2 kids, a 6 and 7-year-old, Torsten and Embla. And she's more or less a housefrau. She has a master's in public health from Berkeley. It's hard convincing Norwegians that degrees from Berkeley are worth anything. She's probably going to have to go back to school and get a PhD or something there. Her husband is a computer guy. Just a little bit about my life. Joanne and I were married for about 25 years, and she went off following a Buddhist guru. After 20 years, she figured out she was in a cult and did figure out how to get a hold of Carl, because she hadn't had any contact with any of us, and get herself back in the family, and that was good. In the intermediate time, I was married to Laura Mignani for about 10 years. Spent a fair amount of time with Heather. After Joanne escaped, we did get back together again, and we got married. She died, about 2 years ago. And this is one of, I say there's contradiction themes. I'm obviously still grieving. I don't expect that to change. At the same time, Heather and I are in a good relationship now. I'm joyful about that. But so you have 2 very contradictory feelings at the same time. And one lives with that. Now, what about work? As I say, after I received my MSW, I went to work in a state hospital, spent my 2 years there paying back my National Institute of Mental Health scholarship, and pretty well burned out of the state hospital. I then went to work actually in another state hospital with what was then mentally retarded, then became developmentally disabled, and it's what now intellectually challenged is the right term, I think. I'm not sure. Folks, working mostly with fairly severely disabled people. And it took me some time to realize that what I was doing there was paying back. I was paying back a debt to my sister. As I say, it took time to kind of figure that out. And actually, I spent about a year in the state hospital, and I wasn't ready for retirement. And, things were pretty low-key in the state hospital. I went to work in community programs, but mostly with developmentally disabled in San Francisco and Marin County. Spent a little bit of that time working with the regional center. Mostly I was working for the state. And that very enjoyable work. And so it wasn't a matter of, I did figure, at some point, I kind of paid my debt, but sort of accidental things happen. I got myself promoted. I got myself promoted into what I didn't expect at all was jobs working in policy with the state, and it's mostly with child welfare and adoption policy. This was not anything I knew about. This was way after we'd adopted Carl, so it was not, adoption did not come out of this. This may have come out a little bit out of the adoption experience, I don't know. And I spent 25 years working in Sacramento doing legislative analysis, program implementation, data analysis, the kind of stuff Sacramento bureaucrats do to make the child welfare program that in California is operated by counties to make that function. Much of the time was focused on how do you increase the stability of the foster care experience? How do you either get children home, or if you can't get children home, how do you provide what in the trade gets called permanence, that is primarily adoption, sometimes guardianship for children. And we were able to probably increase the number of adoptions out of child welfare by a factor of 3 in those years. So we were successful in doing what we were attempting to do. Now, of course, the question that's, because I'm, contradictions and skeptical, the question in my mind is life more stable for those children because they've been adopted than if they've just been raised in foster care? And that's a question we'll be able to answer in another 20 or 30 years. But it seems that it is. So I think what we've been doing, in spite of my really bad first experience with mental health, I think what we've been doing is right. As I was doing this work, I worked quite a bit with folks from Berkeley who did the data, the high-level data analysis for us. And I realized that they knew how to do stuff with data that I didn't know how to do, and that I'd like to learn how to do that. So when I could, I retired early and went to school at Berkeley and got a PhD in social welfare. And by then, being well past the normal retirement age, went to work part-time in what's now called the California Child Welfare Indicators Project, which is at UC Berkeley. And that's what I do now. I work with administrative data about those kids who've received child welfare services in California in the last 20 years, trying to look at this over time, what we call longitudinal data. So what is the experience of those children the long-term experience of those children who are in care? And it's enjoyable work. I'm pretty good at it. I know how to both do the more conceptual stuff, and I know how to work my way through very complicated computer programs, thinking about those programs from the eyes of a child welfare person, and figure out why they're working or not working or what needs to be different. So it's a good place for me to be right now. I don't know how long I'll last. I keep my sort of standard thing as well. When I start making too many mistakes, but I'm still in the mode of discovering other people's mistakes, so I'm there for a while longer. I don't know how long. I do have the model of the grandfather I was raised with, died when I was 3. He was a pharmacist. He worked at a settlement house, medical clinic in Los Angeles. He worked until a couple months before he died. He had cancer, and I guess at the point he couldn't work, he stopped working. So I have that model in the back of my experience here. Okay, Quakerism. As I noted, I was introduced to Quakerism by Alan Hunter. I first attended Friends meetings seriously when I was doing my semester abroad, which was at Howard University in Washington, D.C. Coming to Friends was not a rebellion or a rejection of my religious past. I don't have stories that many of us have. It was a progression. It was kind of a logical place to move from where I'd been. I joined Whitleaf Meeting about 50 years ago, a bit more than that. Seriously, the first two meetings I belonged to, Whitleaf and Marin, have both ceased to be a Whitleaf. It's still a worship group of Orange Grove, but it's not a meeting. Then we moved to Sacramento, and I joined Sacramento Meeting. And then 25 years ago, I came to Berkeley and joined Berkeley Meeting. My association is much more, as I say, I'm a liberal, probably Hicksite Quaker. I belong to Berkeley Meeting because this is where I am. But if I would move from Berkeley someplace else, I would move my membership, because you should be a member of the meeting where you're active. When I travel, I try to go to meeting wherever I am and report back to you all about that. I continue to see myself as a follower of Jesus. I would put myself sort of at the Christian end of the Friends continuum. I'm a theist, but I can't define God. I envy the mystic who has the certainty of the direct experience of God, albeit the mystic can only do what I can do, which is to explain God with metaphor. It's clear to me that we describe God in human terms only because we need a descriptive convenience. That God is not some sort of superhuman. I see prayer as a seeking of direction, not as a way of obtaining what I would view as some special favor from God. To be asked to be healed, to be protected from flood, is asking that others not be, and I really can't conceive of a God that plays favors. I'll protect you from the fire, but I'll not protect you. It just doesn't fit. So the question is not what do I want, but what should I do? That's the prayer question. I don't have any good notions about immortality, but I sort of suspect that the soul simply returns to from whence it came, that it becomes part of the God that it was briefly separated from. Now, what about the mechanics of Quakerism, sort of? Probably the testimony, and I'm well aware of Eric Moon's criticism of Brinton's classification of testimonies, but it's like anthropomorphizing God. It's kind of convenient. Probably the testimony that I've been most consistent in dealing with has been simplicity. It's just played out in a lot of ways. It's played out, I think, in my kind of annoyingly frugal lifestyle. At least my kids would describe that. It's played out in environmental concerns. I'm a life member of the Sierra Club. 35 years ago, when I started worrying about carbon, I built a solar water heater. I moved it from Sacramento to here. I still have it. It still creates hot water for me. This is Berkeley. This is cloudy, so it doesn't do as good a job as it did in Sacramento. But at least half the heat in my water comes from the solar water heater. I use a clothesline. I reuse plastic bags. For most of the last 40 years, I've been a bicycle commuter, except there was that time when I lived here and worked in Sacramento and commuted in a van pool. like Quakers are supposed to. I drive a Prius. We'll get back to the problem there. For most of the last 50 years, I've been a vegetarian. So I've tried to lead a simple life, but there's the problem of integrity. Another testimony. Integrity is important to me. So I may do these things that are supposedly simple. But I spend a lot of time in airplanes. I mentioned my daughters are in Vermont and Norway. Once a year, twice a year, I go to those places. I go to Quaker conferences on the East Coast or in the Midwest. I go to professional conferences. So this undoes any efforts that I've made to. And finally, I drive my Prius more than 10,000 miles a year. So, so it's hard. And again, contradiction. I've been an active friend, the monthly meeting level, the quarterly meeting, the yearly meeting. I've been clerk of several monthly meetings. I've been clerk of the quarterly meeting. I've been recording clerk in all these places. And I have to say, if you have the opportunity, the most enjoyable task of all these tasks was being yearly meeting recording clerk. That's just really nice to do. And it's, to have the demand of having to walk out of that meeting with your minutes done. And that's just really, if you have the chance, take it. I've been on ministry and oversight committees at the quarterly and yearly meeting and monthly meeting level. I'm currently on the quarterly meetings ministry and oversight committee, and I'm on the yearly meetings nominating committee. I'm treasurer here. So I've kind of done all these mechanical things, and I've been on lots of other committees. Two tasks have been very long term. Let's see, almost 35 years ago, a friend in Grass Valley meeting was the yearly meeting registrar and was the yearly meeting, quarterly meeting directory person, or quarterly meeting directory person. And Charlie flew airplanes, and not all was well. I flew with Charlie a couple times. Coming into the Oakland airport, and he's kind of wondering, I wonder where the airport is and where is the landing strip. But anyhow, and one day in a storm, Charlie flew his airplane into the mountain at the Grass Valley Airport, and I inherited the quarterly meeting directory and inherited the yearly meeting registration. I went out, and this is like 1983 or 84. I went out and bought a computer, learned how to use it, and I'm still doing the quarterly meeting directory. Still, much to the embarrassment of people that know about this, using the programs that Charlie wrote. They work very well, but they're primitive, and that bothers people. But they're easy to use, and it's fast. Since then, I've spent a lot of time on and off with yearly meeting registration, either as a registrar or while Berkeley Meeting was scamming the yearly meeting, being the paid registrar, doing that work. That's probably going to come to an end because the yearly meeting automation people are really pushing a higher level of automation than, well, the job has just become more difficult. It used to be easy, and it's not easy anymore because of the automation. And so I'll probably use the excuse that I'm old, but the reality is no, it's just I'm a Luddite. But I've enjoyed doing those things. There's not really much well, let's see. Yeah, I can say it in this crowd, I guess. The only time I've had a Quaker task I've really not been good about has been, or happy with, was when I was on the Quaker House Committee maybe 15 years ago. And that was not a happy time. Outside of the meeting, I've done a couple other outside of formal meeting, quarterly meetings, etc. stuff. I've done a couple other things. I was on the Friends Committee on Legislation Executive Committee for about 20 years. Usually on the Finance Committee, occasionally Personnel, occasionally Policy, but mostly on the finance side of things. That was a good experience. The Friends Committee on Legislation runs from bequest to bequest. If any of you are thinking about places that make a bequest, it's very helpful. It keeps the organization alive. More recently, well, for the last 30 years, I've been on and off the board of Friends Association of Services to the Elderly. It's the group that operates Friends House in Santa Rosa. And this has been an interesting ride. I'm currently the board recording clerk. I'm also currently the token Quaker on the board. So at least one of the resident members of the board is a Quaker, but of the non-resident members, I'm the token Quaker. So it's been an interesting move as Friends House has gone from being a somewhat national Quaker retirement home to being a regional, somewhat atypical retirement home in Sonoma County. I've also been on the Ben Lomond Quaker Center Board 6 years. That's the most enjoyable board experience I've had. Quaker Center is solvent. Its purpose is clear. We've had good staff there. It's a nice board to be on. Again, if you have a chance to be on a board, grab that one. The thing we did when I was on the board that I'm most happy about was that we built a house for the directors, and so they no longer had to live in this building that was standing up only because the termites were holding hands. And I feel good that we actually treat our staff well with that. I've not been on the, what's it called, the Woolman board. I'm a believer in public education, frankly. What else? Okay, well, let me hit the kind of side factoids here that don't fit in neatly. Honest packaging requires that I talk a little bit about my interest in trains. I have no idea why I like trains. I know when we were kids, we would frequently go on picnics in the evening. We'd pick up my father, it was during the summer, my mother wasn't working, we'd pick up my father at work, we'd go to a park and have a picnic. And one of the parks we have a picnic in is Elysian Park in Los Angeles, which is just kind of a little bit north of downtown. And there was a lawn you could sit on there and watch the railroad yard right below it. And that was, heavens knows, fascinating. So maybe it's all my parents' fault, of course. Who knows? At some point I discovered that if you were going to spend time with trains, it was much more fun to spend time with big trains than small trains. And for maybe 20 years or so, I've been volunteering at a railroad museum out in Solano County. At first I worked on the railroad track, but then I got old and when you're old, swinging a pick is no. And I've been working in restoration work. And currently I'm working on an old wooden streetcar. It's 110 years old about. Its career in Alameda County was, a good chunk of it was running from near what's now the North Berkeley BART station to North Spray, back and forth to the shuttle. So I get to spend a lot of time looking at photographs and other stuff like that to figure out how did this thing look at a certain point in time, and how do you make it look like that now? It's enjoyable doing something with my hands, because all this other stuff I've described is all ideas. And I like working with my hands. Although even there in that world, I've spent board time, and I'm currently the organizational secretary, which again means I take minutes. An enjoyable task. Other little factoids. I haven't ever been very tuned into popular culture. I don't enjoy movies. We didn't have a television during most of our childhood. That was when televisions appeared on the world, but they didn't appear in our household. We would go to the neighbors, But when we were raising our children, we didn't have a television in the house. I think I have a television in the house now, but it doesn't work. So I'm deprived of a lot of connections with the popular culture. And while I don't know when I would have time to make those connections, sometimes I worry about it, but not enough to do anything about it. I'm a throwback in other ways. I try to avoid non-union labor, at least in transnational companies. I shop at Safeway. I don't shop at Trader Joe's or Whole Foods. When I have to ship stuff, I use UPS rather than FedEx. I know it's hopeless, but I still do it. I try to buy clothes made in the United States. You can't do this for a lot of things, but you can buy underwear, you can buy socks, you can buy blue jeans, and so I do that. When I lived here, I was a member of the Berkeley Co-op. I was actually on the co-op's election committee for quite a while. And actually I was on the finance committee for a while. I actually didn't do a very good job with that one. I do as much shopping as possible at the Sacramento Natural Foods Co-op. And actually the current crowd of co-ops, Sacramento, Davis, North Coast, what are some of the others? I go to Burlington in Vermont, are doing quite well. And they're doing well because they learned from the mistake of the Berkeley Co-op, which is that you have to absolutely focus on your business and not get involved with petty politics, especially petty Berkeley City politics. So that's sort of it. What were the other things that I haven't said anything about the affinity group I've been part of for 20 years. This is one of my sadnesses maybe about Quakerism. This is an affinity group of people who mostly are much more courageous than I am, who have long criminal records for being arrested for social activism. One of our members is in jail now in the East as a result of a plowshares action. One of our other members has probably been arrested more than anybody else for social activism in the Bay Area. Mostly Catholic folks. It's a good bunch of folks to know and spend time with. Kind of sorry I have to go out of the meeting for that, but that's all right. That's the short but obnoxious version. And I think we're supposed to go have refreshments. We're past that time. I hope someone else hasn't eaten them.
So we can stop now and take our break.
Yeah.
And people can ask questions then afterwards.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so now this is your opportunity to ask questions. No promises about answers. I'll try.
What do you feel is like this may not be a good question, but what do you feel is like a typical or maybe the main contradiction that comes up again and again?
The question is, what is the main contradiction in my life? And clearly the environmental contradiction is one. How does one lead a life that is simple at the same time that you're maintaining family relationships, doing things that you think are enriching, etc. And there's a tension in that, but that's not the only tension by any means. The whole thing of how does one have enough time to contemplate while getting the things done that you want to get done.
You've been in many leadership positions in Quaker communities and work, various settings. So I'm wondering, what was your take on being a leader, especially like in the time when it was somewhat a big deal to have the renovation of the meeting house and move the whole meeting to another location. What was your special thing that you were consciously bringing when you were in this leadership position?
Let me deal with that question kind of in two different ways. The question was, being in a leadership position when the meeting is in a time of maybe not turmoil, but a time of having to make many decisions and move about in ways that are not always easy. First thing is that being a clerk, especially in a Quaker meeting, is not really a leadership position. The task of the clerk is to try to understand where the meeting is being led, and then to help the meeting do that. But so the clerk doesn't really lead the meeting. The clerk helps the meeting know where it's going, where it needs to go. With the meeting house renovation, with the time that I was clerk during that, I was very aware of how this was disruptive to us and how having to focus on place, on building, especially when we were meeting someplace else, was very difficult for us in terms of maintaining community. I would like to know how we could have done a better job of maintaining community while that was going on. But I was very aware of that. And quickly, we changed clerks at the point we moved back here, and it was sort of time to say we had a break from that experience, and now we were in a different place not just physically, but a different place in terms of our relationships with each other and what was important to us. Now, in other roles, I do think that one of the roles of, for example, of the Ministry and Care Committee or people like Property Committee is to sort of shelter the meeting from some of the chaos. So that the meeting as a whole doesn't have to stew about some of this stuff. Yeah.
You feel that, have any feeling about the degree to which people are confident in testimonies that the Quakers have had over 300 years at the present time? A main example, the peace testimony that upon which our country completely turns its back. We're living in a country that is the #1 purveyor of destruction and violence in the whole planet, and yet we have this testimony.
Well, first of all, I think it's very clear that Quakers are atypical. We are not the mainstream of our country. And the peace testimony is one example of that, but a lot of the other things about our lives are also part of that. I think that we got a bit diluted in the Vietnam era. You know, in thinking that where we were was kind of mainstream. Because finally our unwillingness to participate in war isn't because war is ineffective or because maybe the cause is bad. It's because preparing to go out and kill people is inconsistent with our beliefs. And the problem with Vietnam is that you had a war with no clear objectives and from a pragmatic point of view, this was a crazy thing to be doing. But our unwillingness to participate was not a pragmatic thing. Now, in fairness, that's probably been more true of Orthodox friends than Hicksite friends. Starting with the Civil War, Hicksite friends were more willing to say, well, this one time, it's a good cause and we should go pursue it. I did think of a couple of little side stories I didn't mention. Again, honesty and packaging. My recreational activity, besides working on old streetcars, is doing puzzles. And I'm not very good at it. I mean, I can get through Tuesday and sometimes Wednesday in the New York Times crosswords, but that's about it. I can get through the Chronicle crosswords most times all week. And I can get through the Chronicle Sudokus most times all week. But that's my downtime recreational activity. One thing I thought of. The other thing about family relationships, sometimes when a parent dies, the rest of the family sort of falls apart. And the children and I have been quite conscious about this and doing things that keeps us together, and not just in a one-to-one relationship of me with one particular child that I happen to be visiting, but keeps us all together. And we do a reading group about once a month, and we'll read something in advance, and then we'll come together on Zoom it is, but you could do it on any number of chat kind of things, and talk to each other for an hour or so about what we've read, but also talk to each other about just where we are in our lives. And that's been really a very good tool for our cohesion. And tomorrow afternoon we talk about the book of Job.
Joe, despite what you said, I do appreciate all of your leadership and your being a role model. I wonder if you could speak about other role models you've had in our Quaker meeting.
Because there's certainly been a lot. You know, in very current times, I certainly appreciate Roy Allen. And you know, there's the public Roy Allen that we experienced, but also I've had a lot of personal interaction with Roy. It's been most supportive, and you know, I've known Roy for, I suppose, almost 50 years. So, and there's certainly lots of people. You know, the first yearly meeting clerk I was exposed to was a woman named Madge Seaver, who was in San Francisco meeting. And her ability to keep us focused. Madge Seaver. You know, this is before everybody's time here. But you remember Madge, yeah. But there's just lots of people. And again, part of my, I didn't talk about this so much, that I'm a gradualist, and I don't tie to single events. I much more assume that a person's behavior or decisions one makes is based on many different experiences. And so I'm not so good at pointing to one person and saying, you know, that person changed my life. You know, it's the combination of all these people over time that slowly nudge, and experiences that slowly nudge a person. That's for me. You know. So I wouldn't be a good person to have the road to Damascus experience. You know, a single event doesn't usually do it.
A 100 years ago, the proper topics of adult conversation were sex, death, and taxes. 50 years ago, it was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I think today the only topic is global warming. You spoke of your desire to have the smallest carbon footprint you could, but all those topics, can you amplify on any of them?
Well, so I'm not very much part of the popular culture, so I really can't deal with drugs and rock and roll very well. I say this, I mentioned service committee's work projects, and Joanna and I directed what was probably the last national AFSC work project, which was a high school project with kids in the Central Valley working with self-help housing. And I still know some of those folks. But clearly we were not equipped to deal with sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And that was the reality of the era. I don't know. I've lived a pretty sheltered life, believe it or not. Margaret?
You have children and grandchildren,
Yes.
quite different situations.
Uh-huh.
Where do you find hope and optimism for the future?
Sometimes that's in short supply. I mean, certainly as a human collective, we're faced with climate change, we're faced with overpopulation, we're faced with the ability to do horrendous wars, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, I'm impressed with my grandkids. I'm impressed with what they're doing. I'm impressed with, especially my oldest grandson's values. I've been impressed with my kids' values. My oldest daughter's ability to function in the business world and to have a very strong ethical compass is something I really appreciate. It's easier to find hope in the individual people I have to deal with than kind of in the collective of all of our situation. But if we give up hope, then there's no chance. So it's better to have sort of an irrational false hope than no hope at all. George?
Well, this is a very shallow question, but I'm totally blown away by and I'm impressed when I see your treasurer's reports. They have color and they're many pages and all so incredibly complicated. And I'm wondering how you acquired this skill. You say that when Charlie died, you bought yourself a computer and learned how to manage the quarterly meeting directory and the yearly meeting,
Registration.
And we're about the same generation, and I was treasurer once, and Henry Helson let me use his Model 1 Radio Shack computer, and I could kind of get some of the arithmetic on the computer, but I had no idea. And I can sort of do a few emails now, but did you take courses, or did you teach yourself, or how did this miracle happen?
Well, let me answer that a couple different ways. The treasurer stuff, that's a matter simply of being able to be a good follower, and Roy and then Tom Hinshaw developed the methodology with the computer program QuickBooks that we use to do it. So all I have to do is understand sort of how it works and not mess anything up, and I can keep it going. Now, I call myself a Luddite. I'm employed basically because I know how to understand very complex data analysis computer programs and how to write them. So, did I take classes? Yeah, I took some classes. And I've done a lot of work with it over the years. Computers are, can be recreation. That can be frustrating too, yeah. Yeah.
One of the things that I've thought about you always is how you are patient and thoughtful. And the other side of you that I think about is you on working on the property and working a lot with your hands. And you talked about that a little bit. I'm wondering if you've ever done anything with model trains, or how you kind of join those together.
I did model train stuff when I was like in high school. And then sort of, his family and everything else, and didn't do that. And then say when I then kind of had time for it and discovered that, hey, you can work on big trains, and this is more fun. So, yeah. I mean, I do enjoy precision stuff, and it's really, I'm constantly amazed by the skill of people in the late 1800s, early 1900s. When you look at the system that makes a streetcar's brakes work, this makes Rube Goldberg proud. And it's fun to work with stuff like that, to understand it. Fred?
When I first started going to quarterly meeting, I believe it was 1977, I very quickly found that the business meeting was very tedious. So for about my first 3 years, I did the children's program. And I met Carl and his sister. I must have been about 8 or 7, 8, 9, something like that. And I don't know if you covered this because of my hearing, but they always performed violin during these talent nights, either at quarterly or at yearly meeting. And I don't know whose idea it was to get them violin lessons, because the violin is a very difficult instrument to play. So I wonder if you'd say...
Carl and the violin. When Carl was, I don't know, well, we still lived in Mill Valley, so he must have been in 1st or 2nd grade at that point. He said to us, I think he said to Joanne, I want to learn how to play the violin. And kind of the question was, well, what gave you that idea? Well, my aunt, Maggie, my sister, plays the violin. So he'd seen that. So this was his idea. He took violin lessons, all the way through. He still plays the violin. He'll go play the violin for people who are dying. It's part of his job. But yeah, he's had the perseverance. Well, now, he started off with Suzuki. Suzuki has positives and negatives. The negative of Suzuki is you don't learn to read music very well. His music reading ability is there, but not the best. Fortunately, his ear is extremely good, so he can listen to something and play it for you. And you've reminded me, I have to ask him what the bow on top of our piano is doing right now. It's his, and it's supposed to get fixed by somebody.
You've been a Quaker for 50 years?
Yeah.
Do you think Quakerism or Quaker meetings
Well, we don't know the future, of course, and Quakerism has evolved an awful lot. If you do some of our Quaker history classes, you realize that Quakers 150 years ago were extremely certain about their Christianity, which is something that's changed a lot. I wonder how we're going to change. I'd like to know that. I hope that we survive. We're in an era where organized religion is not doing well. We're actually doing better than a lot of folks are. I think I would, now what would I like? I would certainly like it if we could be more able to talk with each other about belief. And to be able to talk about belief is not the same thing as to be able to convert each other. But we tend to not talk with each other about things that are very important to each other because we're afraid either we'll offend somebody or that someone will think that we're trying to convert them, or we don't encourage people to talk to us because we think they're trying to, convert us. I would like us to be more able to share with each other. Margaret?
I appreciate you cooking with the kids in the children's program, making soups and getting them to chop onion, make a soup at the end of the hour while their parents or guardians or grandparents in the meeting. So what is your kind of general, when you're working with kids, what are you coming with?
I think several things. One thing is that you would like the children to have a creative experience with each other. I think we'd like the children to know us as people. I would actually be more critical of how we have worked with children. Back to our fear of talking about belief. The reading groups that I was talking about our family doing, last thing we did was kind of a quick read through the book of Mark. I'm really disappointed by the lack of what I would call biblical literacy on the part of our children. Our inability to say, these are things that you should know about. And that's different than saying these are things you should believe. But that kind of these foundational things, foundational experiences we've been afraid to share with our kids. And I'm sorry about that. You know, and here I have one kid who's been to seminary and still. We pretty well run out of time here, I think. Thank you. Thank you. Now I can be an official old man. Well, there's one more part of my life. For the last 15 years or so, one day a week I've gotten up at 5 in the morning and gone and cooked and served breakfast with Dorothy Day for this eclectic group of homeless or quasi-homeless people that spend time on the streets in Berkeley. Many of these folks are folks who 50 years ago would have been state hospital people, and that ties back to what I was talking about earlier. As always, my reasons for doing this are mixed. One of my fellow doctoral students asked me to do it, and so I really couldn't say no. But then also, Jesus is reported to have said, although the Jesus seminars people say that he didn't say it, that just as you've given food to the least of these, you've given it to me being Jesus. And so that's something we should be doing. And finally, this is a way of my making up for, in a very small way, for being part of that effort to move the chronically mentally ill out of state hospitals and on to what we thought was a better life and what in fact has turned out to be the street or jail. So it also is a way of my dealing with guilt. So in the end, I'm not sure why I do these meals, why I've done it so long, why I will keep doing it, but I feel it's the right activity for me to be doing with my time.